The archetypal story unearths a universally human experience, then wraps itself inside a unique culture-specific expression. This is one of the first lines written in Robert McKee's 1998 book Story, and to me it is the base explanation of what makes storytelling the most important tool our species has. In a world where religion progressively becomes obsolete, where philosophy is read only by university students and narcissistic YouTubers, and where societal value structures have become peripheral, it serves that mainstream storytelling would become the primary means of attempting to understand the human condition. And as Robert McKee, along with every other significant storyteller recognized, it is only through archetypal stories that these attempts can flourish. So let's ask the question. What exactly is an archetype? Certainly not the first, but definitely the most notable identifier of human archetypes was the psychologist Carl Jung, a student and successor of Sigmund Freud, and the father of analytical psychology. Jung can be largely accredited with the conceptualization of the conscious and unconscious self, the collective unconscious, the idea of synchronicity, extroversion and introversion, and perhaps most importantly, a selection of universal primal events, symbols, images, and motifs that collectively came to be known as the Jungian archetypes. An interconnected web of underlying feelings and behaviors intrinsic to the human experience, which become consciously apparent only when expressed in cultural or individual symbols, whether in art, myths, or dreams. A simple way of thinking of this concept is to imagine invisible ink that can only be read when a UV light is shone onto it, except the invisible ink literally spells out the meaning of life. In other words, the means by which people reach a greater understanding of their existence seems to have been consistent throughout the whole of human history, regardless of superficial differences in their presentations. Universal Jungian archetypes are the reason for the North Tale of Amleth being reflected by the Shakespearean story of Hamlet, which would then be reflected by Disney's The Lion King, and once again be reflected by Robert Eggers' 2022 epic The Northman. It's the same reason why the Christian story of Cain and Abel almost exactly mirrors the ancient Egyptian myth of Set and Osiris, and the same reason for aspects of Homer's story of the Iliad being noticeable in countless modern works, which brings us perfectly to the focus of this video. Carl Jung identified numerous archetypal events, figures, and motifs, mostly relating to the dreams of the patients of his psychological practices, and throughout the 20th century, other psychoanalysts and cultural theorists built on his initial identifications to eventually form a collection of 12 distinct archetypal characters. The jester, the everyman, the caregiver, the ruler, the creator, the innocent, the sage, the explorer, the outlaw, the magician, the lover, and finally, the hero. Along with the identification of archetypal events, figures, and motifs, Carl Jung also conceptualized the idea of individuation, the process by which an individual distinguishes their conscious and unconscious selves, where the aspects of a person's psyche and their physical being are integrated into a collective whole. A self-actualized being with a greater understanding of their own existence. This process of individuation, Jung posited, was subconsciously or not the central task and focus of any human being, or in the simplest possible way, the purpose of a human's life. And when this process was brought about in the life of a fictional character, that is when an archetypal story is born. With the 12 identifiable Jungian character archetypes comes a vast expanse of archetypal stories that can be told, but perhaps the most famous and most widespread archetypal story comes when the quest for individuation is imprinted onto the archetypal hero, otherwise known as the hero's journey. This hero's journey can be found across the wide expanse of storytelling, from The Matrix to Star Wars to Lord of the Rings to Pinocchio to Harry Potter to The Lion King. Whilst it's massively prevalent in novels and films, this archetypal story, or as it's otherwise known, this monomyth, can also be found in the young medium of video games, in games like Kingdom Hearts and Ocarina of Time. One of the advantages video games have in storytelling, as opposed to most other mediums, is the sheer length they allow a viewer to spend connecting with a single character. Aside from first-person novels, there isn't really another medium that can so inextricably connect the protagonist to the player, and only in video games can this be done for tens, if not hundreds of hours. This aspect of the structure of games, however, can be a blessing and a curse, as redundant plot points and repetitive character moments are far more likely to rear their ugly heads when so much time is open to be explored. So, great care must be taken to continue moving a video game's protagonist forward in the world, physically, emotionally, spiritually. A progression of story needs to be tightly maintained to avoid running the risk of a character's journey becoming stale. In order to stay engaged in a character's journey, especially over multiple games, said games need to continually grow the character, move the character forward in the world, and take the player to numerous notable events in their lives. Which brings us perfectly onto the focus of this video, Ezio Auditore. A character who was instantly iconic on his first appearance back in 2009, a character that sparked a gaming monolith, a character who still defines the franchise he belongs to, Assassin's Creed. I know it may come as a surprise that Ubisoft, the pioneer of mediocre, repetitive, money-sucking cash cows, once cared about telling truly compelling stories in their games. But despite the last decade's downfall, there was a time when this company stood at the peak of innovation in the gaming industry, and their creation of the Assassin's Creed franchise may just be the epitome of that. But more importantly than their effects on the gaming industry was Patrice Désilets, Corey May, Jeffrey Yohalem, and Darby McDevitt's impact on storytelling as a whole over the span of 3 games, each releasing less than a year apart from one another. Because in this time, audience saw these writers craft what I genuinely believe to be the greatest character in fictional history, and along with it, the most fundamentally perfect hero's journey in modern storytelling. This is Ezio Auditore and the hero's journey.
Auditore, but please, call me Ezio.
I know you're there, Ezio! The Pope told me about you and your little group of assassins. And this!
Another artifact. No. You will stay here.
The Auditore are not dead! I'm still here! Me! Renowned master and mentor, Ezio. Ezio Auditore da Firenze.
Our belief in humanity rests at the heart of the Assassin Brotherhood.
To say that nothing is true is to realize that the foundations of society are fragile, and that we must be the shepherds of our own civilization. To say that everything is permitted is to understand that we are the architects of our actions, and that we must live with their consequences, whether glorious or tragic.
Chains will not hold me! I will not die by the hand of man!
Then I leave you in the hands of fate.
Do you regret your decision to live as an assassin for so long?
I do not remember making that decision. This life, it chose me.
It is a good life we lead, brother.
The best. They never change.
And may it never change us.
We begin our story in the dusty streets of Florence at dusk. As the sun sets on yet another day in the bustling centre of the Italian Renaissance, crowds gather on the Ponte Vecchio, overlooking the beautiful Arno River, where in the heart of the city, a 17-year-old Ezio Auditore stands to address the crowd, already a leader of men. This is the ordinary world. Before a hero's journey can begin, the hero in question must first be identified. It takes not simply any woman or man involved in a plot, but a person of true exception to undertake this journey. Author Susan Sanchez lays out 2 distinct elements of a character that must be intrinsic to their presentation to form a hero. 1, a person noted for courageous acts or nobility of character, and 2, a person who, in the opinion of others, has extraordinary achievements, abilities, or personal qualities, and is regarded as a role model or an ideal. This first sequence from its first scene sets out to align both of these traits to Ezio's character, and the opinion of others in regards to Ezio are immediately verified by the crowd of fellow Florentines cheering the boy on as he speaks out against the slander his family has faced at the hands of the Pazzi. From the offset, Ezio's single-minded focus, his motivation, his purpose is protecting his family, and in this case, his family's honour and reputation. An honourable act that, although isn't executed with the most tact and diplomacy, clearly comes from a place of love, care, and nobility. This all shown in only a minute of storytelling, and only a few lines of dialogue, and a single striking image of Ezio supported by his community. The principle of show don't tell executed to perfection. This opening minute presents Ezio with both of the character traits that are essential to form a hero, a baseline of nobility and honour that remains an underpinning facet of his character moving forward, regardless of the actions he goes on to take. This ordinary world sees Ezio as the hero. Thanks to this foundation that is laid for Ezio's character in the first encounter with him, the rest of the scene is open to present the audience with the major flaws in Ezio's mindset, the flaws in his ideals and in his efforts. A flawed and layered character can now be built, without the need to tear down his morality or humanity to do so. Too often, writers go to excessive lengths to create flaws in their characters, which when done right can produce the likes of Travis Bickle and Macbeth, but when done wrong usually results in a disconnect between the audience and the character. Why empathize with a character who has malicious intent? Why root for a bad person? To strike a balance of character flaws and likability, the righteous elements of a protagonist must be intrinsic to their true character, not simply to their words. They must have understandable and redeemable intentions in spite of their flawed characteristics. As the scene continues, these flawed characteristics are progressively revealed, as Ezio and his brother Federico engage in a street fight with their family rivals, a seemingly petty squabble which ends with them the victors. Federico from the offset is shown to be Ezio's main source of guidance, the protector figure that a big brother should be, and so while Ezio pines to continue charging at their enemies, Federico takes a step back and ensures his little brother's well-being first. This moment acts as the first step in seeing the mutual care that is spread throughout the entire Auditore family. Just as Ezio defends the honour of his family name, his family ensures to defend his health and his existence. Immediately, Federico is positioned as a sympathetic sibling, a good brother, and so when the two young men ascend the Santa Trinitae Church, the player sees a bond that they want to stay strong, in spite of the beautifully tragic foreshadowing making it clear that won't be the case.
It is a good life we lead, brother.
The best. May it never change.
And may it never change us.
As Ezio and his brother gaze over their city, peaceful and quiet, Ezio takes a moment to consider how to spend the rest of his night. Perhaps in the arms of a young Cristina Vespucci. Despite opposition from his brother, Ezio makes his way down to street level for a late night visit, reinforcing perhaps Ezio's biggest flaw. He's impulsive, brash, and unable to comprehend any of the wider ramifications of his actions. Everything one would expect from an immature 17-year-old thrust into the world with money and influence. Although this moment is minor in its consequences, it opens an extra layer of characterization for Ezio, as well as another aspect of his ordinary world that he cares about deeply, that he has no interest in leaving behind. Cristina, his first love. Returning to his home, Ezio sees his family members in need, and so we see a new, less violent perspective on Ezio's care for his family, as he helps his sickly younger brother collect feathers, helps his mother run errands, and, well, also beats the shit out of his sister's fiancé. Okay, maybe not all of it is non-violent. But in only an hour or so of playtime, Ezio has layered motivations that go far wider than his own selfish desires. A loyalty to his family, an adoration of his city, an intimate love, all noble and respectable traits that are at the core of Ezio's character. And so when his father Giovanni sends the boy on work errands and we gain our first insight into his own personal ambitions, they come across not as his fundamental wants, but as background surface level motivations. In spite of these career desires not being at the very core of Ezio's character, he takes them on out of a loyalty to his father, who clearly has great belief in Ezio's ability to take on the responsibility of the prestigious family name as he grows older. Again, re-establishing those two key traits of a hero. A person noted for courageous acts or nobility of character, and a person who in the opinion of others has extraordinary achievements, abilities, and personal qualities, and is regarded as an ideal. At this point, Ezio's character is fully established, as is the world around him, and the link between Ezio and his world is made complete. Florence is as important to Ezio as Ezio is to Florence. The two work in harmony, and feel so interconnected because of this layered, multi-dimensional build of character and of motivation. As such, when Ezio returns from his errands to find his villa ransacked, his mother and sister attacked, his brothers and fathers gone, and his world in disarray, it hits the player in the same way it hits Ezio, and so the inciting incident is born. Ezio, whose main conscious desire thus far has been to defend his family, now sees a personal conflict that directly attacks that exact goal, establishing a quest that begins the moment he uncovers his father's hidden cabinet, suiting up in Giovanni's ice-white robes and sheathing the sword his father left for him to protect the Auditore name. But unfortunately for Ezio, it's too late. Despite his best efforts, he's unable to prevent the inevitable, and so, the next morning, he faces a turning point that entirely transforms the trajectory of his life, and of the world around him.
Giovanni Auditore, you and your accomplices stand accused of the crime of treason. Have you any evidence to counter this charge?
Yes, the documents that were delivered to you last night.
I'm afraid I know nothing of these documents.
He's lying!
In the absence of any compelling evidence to the contrary, I am bound to pronounce you guilty. You and your collaborators are hereby sentenced to death.
You are the traitor, Roberto, and one of them! You may take our lives this day, but we will have yours in return, I swear! We will! Father!
There! Grab the boy! He's one of them!
I'll kill you for what you've done!
Guards! Arrest him!
Abatetelo. You'd better run, boy. And fast.
Jason Hellerman once wrote that a screenplay lives and dies by the call to adventure moment, the event that leaves your protagonist at a crossroads, with the choices available to them open to further reveal their true character. In cases where this moment falls flat, it's often due to a lacking connection with the protagonist, a misrepresentation of their motivations, and a plot point that fails to directly attack these motivations. But as we've thus established, Ezio to this point has been perfectly built up as the archetypal hero, and his desires, both personal and extra-personal, have been firmly established. How do you attack the soul of a man whose being revolves around the protection of his family and of his city? You tear that family apart, you kill the ones he loves, and you turn his city against him for the rest of time. Suddenly, he goes from noble Florentine banker to isolated outcast, through no fault of his own or those around him. The make or break of this entire journey is this one single execution, and because it directly attacks the core center of Ezio's being as a man, it easily hooks us on his initial journey for revenge against Uberto Alberti, the man who betrayed his house. However, if Ezio's journey was merely to avenge his father and brothers, he would have no story to be told. There would be no resistance against Ezio taking up his father's mantle and regaining honor in Florence. No, despite Ezio initially focusing all efforts on the death of Uberto, it is by no means his driving motivation, and so once he completes the task with the aid of Paola and Leonardo da Vinci, his mind falls back on the protection of the family he has left. Ezio's call to adventure isn't a call to take revenge on those who wronged him. This story is not a revenge story. His call to adventure is a call to disregard all expectations he had for his life, to throw away all extra-personal ambitions, and to take on his family's mantle as an assassin, to embrace the creed that his Uncle Mario lays out to him as he arrives in Monteriggioni after fleeing his home. Ezio was set to be a banker, a wealthy Florentine, an additional layer to the growth and innovation of the Florentine Renaissance, but by the third sequence of the game, not only has he lost his family, his home, but most importantly, he's lost his place in the world. He knows not who he is or what his purpose is, and he's left with very little guidance to discover it. This trilogy is not a revenge tale, it's a story of self-discovery.
The Auditori are not dead! I'm still here! Me! Ezio! Ezio Auditore!
You want to leave, Ezio? To throw away everything your father fought and died for? To deny your heritage?
By the time Ezio reaches his uncle's villa in the Tuscan countryside, he's had his revenge, striking his family's traitor down with a hidden blade and utilising the skills of an assassin, and so the player is in full expectation that he'll fall straight into a life of violence, taking up the tenets of the creed, especially as Mario lays out the history of the Brotherhood and his father's place in it. However, as is shown from the very first sequence, the workings of his father have never been Ezio's main priority, and so he not only hesitates, but outright refuses Mario's offer to train him and induct him into the Brotherhood. Not only is Ezio disinterested in the conflicts of the Assassins and Templars, he thinks they're absolute fantasy. Ancient wars, brotherhoods, codex pages, and pieces of Eden. It sounds comical to a young man who seeks only to get his sister and mother out of danger. To embrace these ramblings of his uncle, to fight this supposed ancient war, to accept his uncle's call, could leave Ezio at even further risk of losing those he loves, of failing in his new role as head of his house, to disrupt his own plans for the sake of a brotherhood he barely believes exists, to willingly keep himself and his family in the path of harm's way for the sake of his heritage. It's an idea that Ezio understandably doesn't welcome with open arms. Why intentionally throw his life into further chaos? Thankfully, before he can completely abandon his uncle's offer, he's faced with a dilemma, as Vieri de Pazzi and his forces begin causing chaos throughout the Tuscan countryside, and in particular, he causes trouble for Mario. And although he's only just reunited with his uncle, Ezio feels a sense of loyalty and duty, if only to repay Mario for his hospitality. And so this, coupled with a brash personal vendetta for Vieri, is enough to push Ezio out to aid his uncle in San Gimignano, to help in the fight against the Pazzi forces. This decision from Ezio, though, comes from a place almost entirely contradictory to the heroic aspect of his nature, with his motivation entirely impure. Ezio, thus far motivated by love, honour and duty, in this moment allows spite and rage to take him over, traits we've only seen glimpses of in the man to this point. And as he fights and kills his boyhood rival, we're reminded that Ezio is still just that. A boy, immature, brash, impulsive, and at times a reflection of the evil nature of his enemies. So as Ezio strikes down Vieri, it's presented not as a victory, but as a bittersweet moment of necessity, wherein Ezio needs reminding from his uncle as to how to act and position himself in the world, always from a place of respect and honour.
Pezzo di merda! Vorrei solo che avessi sofferto di più! Hai avuto la fine che meritavi! Spero che
Enough, Ezio! Show some respect.
Respect? After all that's happened, do you think he would have shown either of us such kindness?
You are not Vieri. Do not become him. Che la morte ti dia le pace che cercavi. Requiesca in pace.
By this point, Ezio's refusal to the call to adventure is still very much in place, intercut only by a moment of impulse. Ezio still hasn't made the conscious choice to fight for his father's creed, or to fight at all for that matter. It's only after he uncovers a conspiracy to kill another major Florentine family that he makes the decision to make base in Monteriggioni, because aside from his family, the one care Ezio holds above all else is his city, even after they've abandoned him. Although he claims to be taking on his father's work, he chooses this path selfishly, to both further his own revenge and to protect his city. So when he hears talks of a planned attack on the Medici family, the family that is largely responsible for Florence's rise to prominence and power, Ezio finally finds a strong enough desire to divert his path, to accept the call, to willfully throw his own life into further chaos for the greater good. The most vital aspect of Assassin's Creed 2's writing, the thing that separates it from other Assassin's Creed stories, is that nothing Ezio does is contrived or coincidental. Every single choice he makes has well-defined personal motivation, which is layered on top of the extra personal motivations present throughout the entire series. Its conflicts are layered multidimensionally, never leaving any gaps in its protagonist's chosen path. Returning to story for a moment, Robert McKee lays out a design for which protagonists can be confronted with their innermost self, a design which sets out three major paths to overcome, that of inner conflicts, personal conflicts, and extra-personal conflicts. In terms of Ezio, these three levels of conflict can be seen gradually progressing throughout each of his respective games. Despite his familial motivation, he's never challenged on a personal level after the death of his father and brothers. The challenges Ezio faces in Assassin's Creed 2 are extra-personal, a triad of conflicts that interlink to form the first step on his hero's journey. His physical environment, a changing Italy that faces constant political struggle, stands as Ezio's first conflict. His second, individuals in society, his family rivals the Pazzi, the Barbarigo family, and of course the Borgia. And finally, social institutions, more specifically the institution that is the Templar Order. After the death of Vieri, Ezio sees the obligations to his uncle as complete, and so is more than welcome to continue on his pursuit to escape the country with his mothers and sisters. However, in the process of finding and killing Vieri, Ezio stumbles across a larger conspiracy, a conspiracy that ties into his family's death, a conspiracy to kill the Medici, to take control of Florence and wider Italy, and so is faced with a new curve in the road, a new pathway opened up to him. Therefore, even when he returns to Florence, Ezio is yet to fully cross the threshold into his journey. He hasn't taken up the mantle of assassin, he's merely exploring this pathway, driven by this new conflict, this new attack against his home, an attack which now he's able to prevent. Ezio intervenes, so that Lorenzo de' Medici's son will never have to feel the way he felt. For this, Ezio is rewarded with grace and honour, being taken back in as a son of the city he was driven out of. In Lorenzo, Ezio sees a reflection of his own father, and is now faced with an urge to protect him from the social institutions that tore his own family down. This desire leads Ezio to hunt down the remaining Pazzi conspirators, and in killing them, ending the cycle of corruption that's plagued his beautiful city, as he symbolically prevents the death of the Medici. After tearing down the conspiracy, Ezio steps into the shadows of an ancient Roman theatre, and for the first time he comes face to face with his seeming greatest foe, Rodrigo Borgia. And as the echoes of Rodrigo's taunts bounce around the Roman ruins, Ezio is also faced with his true journey, in a subtle moment of foreshadowing that echoes what's on the horizon for the young man if he continues following this ever-growing conspiracy. In order to follow it through though, Ezio need take a greater step than he's taken yet, must commit to a decision that he cannot go back on. He must cross the threshold of his home, the home he's been welcomed back into, and travel through mountains and across seas to the distant city of Venice. To this point, Ezio has maintained a staunch intention to eventually take his mother and sister to safety. He's always been close enough to step away from his uncle's scuffles and Lorenzo's battles to retreat back into a world at least somewhat familiar to him. His own fear, the trauma he was left with after that execution, has left him passive, fighting for others as to allow him to procrastinate his own personal growth, to stay frozen in time. Left conflicted, Ezio seeks the advice of the closest thing to a friend he has, Leonardo da Vinci, only to find his trusted advisor has left Florence also, in a coincidental turn of events to travel to the Serene Republic, which acts as the last piece of convincing Ezio needs to take the leap, to leave Tuscany and to step into his own shoes, become his own man and move forward in his journey. And so, Ezio and Leonardo step off the Forlì docks to begin their crossing of the Adriatic Sea, and in turn, Ezio finally crosses the threshold. It's at this point where I think it's finally time to discuss Joseph Campbell, the man responsible for the entire concept of the monomyth. In his 1948 book, The Hero with 1,000 Faces, Campbell lays out the structure of the archetypal hero's journey, a structure that's been simplified and streamlined in the 75 years since, but a structure that still stands in line with the story of Ezio. For Campbell, the monomyth is split into 3 distinct chapters, the second of which begins when the hero accepts their fate and takes on their chosen path. With this, the hero comes across tests, allies, and enemies, or as Campbell puts it, they walk their road of trials. Once having traversed the threshold, the hero moves in a dream landscape of curiously fluid, ambiguous forms where he must survive a succession of trials. Having traversed the mountains of the Italian countryside, the grime of Romagna, and the waters of the Adriatic Sea, Ezio reaches the floating city of Venice, a city built on water, a city that shouldn't be able to exist, in which mysterious power structures constantly battle in political conflict. The hero is covertly aided by the advice, amulets, and secret agents of the supernatural helper whom he met before his entrance into this region. Ezio, leaving Tuscany, is left only with the advice of his uncle Mario, as well as, unbeknownst to him, a plethora of allies loyal to the Assassin Order, guiding him through his journey. Paola, La Volpe, and now Antonio, Theodora, and Bartolomeo aid Ezio in his dismantling of the Templar power structure that is weaving its way into Venetian politics through terror and deceit. In order to succeed, Ezio must take on new methods and risk himself further. To kill Emilio Barbarigo, he must learn the way of the Thieves' Guild. To kill Carlo Grimaldi, he must leap from a tower with only the wings of Leonardo da Vinci's experimental flying machine. To kill Marco Barbarigo, he must put aside his assassin learnings and instead utilize legal and practical ways to access his target. And to kill Silvio Barbarigo, he must lead a fully fledged citywide assault against the arsenal. In this way, the creators of Assassin's Creed 2 were able to interweave their unique and groundbreaking mission structure into Ezio's story in a narratively meaningful way, allowing for this second chapter to be filled with constant progression and steadily increasing stakes to avoid running the risk of repetition and boredom. Perhaps most importantly, this chapter of Ezio's life also sees him fail time and time again, failure being something he rarely faced in his fight against the Pazzi. He fails to prevent the death of the Doge, he fails to gain legal entry into Marco's party, he fails to prevent the Templar ship from travelling to Cyprus. However, through these failures, Ezio continually learns and grows. His understanding of the workings of the world becomes more nuanced. He comes to find that in spite of perfect planning and execution, the social institutions around him can easily overpower his own desires. He comes to understand that the things his Uncle Mario told him of the Codex, the Pieces of Eden, and the Assassins and Templars were not only true, but of vital importance. And most importantly, by the time we reach Ezio's 27th birthday, we see a boy who's grown fully into a man, and is left after 10 years of self-discovery with nothing but endless questions. Questions about his place in the world, and about the greater purpose he serves. Questions that will only be answered by Ezio further sacrificing himself for the sake of his journey. It may be that he here discovers for the first time that there is a benign power everywhere supporting him in his superhuman passage. After hunting down the apple and in turn uncovering Rodrigo Borgia, Ezio is faced with his greatest test thus far, only for his allies to appear to aid him one final time, a reveal that Ezio was always supported by the Brotherhood. As Niccolo Machiavelli reveals, the Assassin Brotherhood has continually been guiding Ezio, guiding him to that exact point in time, a point in time prophesied by Altair. The prophet will appear when the second piece is brought to the floating city.
Theodora! What? What are you all doing here?
Perhaps the same thing you are, Ezio. Hoping to see the prophet appear.
I came here to kill the Spaniard. I couldn't care less about your prophet. He never showed up.
No? But you did.
What?
A prophet's arrival was foretold. And unbeknownst to us, here you are. Perhaps all along, you were the one we sought.
It's only after being faced with these tests, meeting these allies, and facing his enemies that Ezio can reach a stage of acceptance and step into his superhuman passage to become an assassin and to become the Prophet. I realise at this point that I've gotten this far into the video on a video game without once mentioning the qualities that make Assassin's Creed 2 a video game, surprising considering the innovative gem that this game was to the industry. I've omitted talking about the gameplay, talking about my favourite aspect of the gameplay, not because I didn't intend to go into it, but because there's others that have an understanding of it greater than I could ever fathom having, that I want to give the spotlight to now. So without further ado, Jacers, do what you do best.
Assassin's Creed was originally designed as a spin-off of Prince of Persia called Prince of Persia Assassins, made by the people who developed Prince of Persia: The Sands of Time. With Prince of Persia being a platformer franchise, parkour and movement overall formed the most important part of the gameplay. Now, Assassin's Creed wanted to lean more towards being a stealth action game than a platformer, but the team decided that they wanted to bring a movement system with some aesthetic and functional similarities to that of Prince of Persia's to an open world setting, and to use the extensive moveset that such a system would require to craft a very specific player fantasy. Their character, the assassin, was to be agile, quick, able to use their environment to their advantage, and a poet of the kill. The inclusion of the ability to freely navigate and interact with the game world at differing levels of verticality instantly laid a massive portion of the groundwork in establishing this fantasy, because having such easy access to a third dimension of traversal instantly multiplies the potential complexity of a world and the number of gameplay possibilities available to the player. Despite the decreased focus on movement relative to Prince of Persia, having parkour be a key element of the gameplay was absolutely essential to the AC devs' vision for their game, so much so that every single demonstration they had for the original Assassin's Creed game started off by demonstrating different elements of the navigation. In terms of gameplay, they wanted parkour to be engaging, fluid, satisfying, and fun. Designing a system that accomplished all of these things while still being accessible and usable within the context of a game that was also focused on social stealth and melee combat was to be no small task. However, looking back at AC1 and the Ezio Trilogy over a decade later, it quickly becomes clear that they knocked it out of the park. A word that is commonly used to describe fight systems in video games is the term freeform, meaning that the system is built around using basic actions that can be chained into many other actions to create different combos, allowing for the player to build their own playstyle within the system. The developers of Assassin's Creed took this approach to their movement system, revolutionizing freeform movement in open-world video games in the process. In the Ezio Trilogy, players had access to many different actions: side ejects, back ejects, catch ledge, manual jumps, quick drops, punch drop, and a few other miscellaneous actions. Side and back ejects could be used to gain access to new movement paths, to quickly change direction while also gaining height, and to extend jump distance. Wall ejects were accessible regardless of context, and the player could cancel wall run animations using ejects and could therefore use them in a way that maintained flow and built momentum and speed during movement chains. Catch ledge could be used to extend the character's jump distance by having them reach out to grab nearby ledges. It could also be used as a safety mechanism, as grabbing a ledge negated all fall damage that would normally be incurred from the character landing on their feet. Manual jumps could be used to override the automation in the system in order to make more precise jumps when necessary, and also to jump onto overhead objects without first having to run up a wall to reach them. Quick drops were useful for pathing downward short distances, and punch drop, though almost certainly not intended by the developers, serves a similar purpose for greater distances. The two drop actions could be intelligently combined with the use of catch ledge and ejects to perform smooth descents from the rooftops. Learning how to use each of these actions to optimize one's movement and look cooler while doing so was part of the core gameplay experience. A well-designed freeform gameplay system allows for self-expression through the mechanics and a real difference in kind in terms of how the gameplay looks. When looking at parkour in the Ezio Trilogy, what can be seen is exactly that. The Assassin's Creed tells us that nothing is true and everything is permitted. The connections to the focus on expression in the Creed's second clause are evident. That said, expressiveness and creativity weren't the only components that formed the design philosophy for the series movement. The latter half of the Creed, as Ezio explains in Revelations, means that we alone are responsible for our actions and that we need to be prepared to accept any and all resulting consequences, whether glorious or tragic. This core philosophy expressed itself not only through narrative, but also through gameplay. The way this manifests itself in movement is that the player is entrusted with a great level of control over their character, which creates a true sense of freedom behind every decision they make. If the player tells Ezio to jump off a ledge, he will never hesitate. If they tell him to run up a wall, he will do it. If they tell him to cancel a wall run into a side eject, he listens instantly. If they demand he launch himself backwards while hanging off the tallest tower in the game, they get instant obedience. Sometimes those actions are good and helpful. Other times they can cause problems or even desynchronization. The game lets the player make mistakes without holding their hand and giving them an "are you sure" pop-up every time they want to do something even remotely risky or undesirable. It's up to the player to decide. It's their responsibility. Compare and contrast this with any following movement system in Assassin's Creed. The games are constantly holding the player's hand, trying to make sure that they never scratch their elbow. Sure, there are ways to bypass the training wheels for a few entries, but before long, the bike with training wheels is replaced with a tricycle. The system becomes almost purely contextual, descents are streamlined, the automation becomes more aggressive, and more. Making mistakes becomes borderline impossible, and made mistakes can often not be attributed to player error, but rather to inconsistent mechanics or broken world geometry. Any sense of risk versus reward that the system once had is completely gone. Any sense of responsibility for one's actions, for one's successes and failures, is either diminished or completely removed. This is antithetical to the Assassin's Creed, and therefore has no place in the series. Time was the focal point of Assassin's Creed's identity was freedom of movement. The Ezio Trilogy understood that, and made a point of showing it. World and level design is an extremely important part of any game, but this importance maintains a unique relationship with games that feature platforming because of how heavily related the gameplay is to the structure and placement of world geometry. Platforming gameplay lives and dies on how the world or level is laid out, because even a game with the best movement mechanics possible would still be awful if the level design never gave the player any opportunity to use them. The teams behind the classic Assassin's Creed games understood this, as many of them had experience in the platforming genre and were fresh off creating what is arguably the most legendary platformer of all time in Prince of Persia: The Sands of Time. Because of this, they knew how to design an environment to gel with the advanced mechanics of their movement system. This is most obvious in the Tomb missions, which were largely linear and heavily movement focused and were a good test of the player's level of mastery with the system. However, the open world nature of the games lent itself to new possibilities when using the system outside of a linear context. The Ezio Trilogy's cities consistently rewarded the player with faster, better feeling movement and a wider arrangement of paths at their disposal when they engage with the system, and used the handcrafted urban architecture to their advantage, combining their many actions in different ways to express themselves through movement. And, unlike what would be seen in following entries, the vast majority of the important gameplay took place in these cities, and as a result, the majority of the player's time was spent exploring urban environments. The worlds in Ezio's games were basically open-ended platforming levels, and traversing them was the Assassin's Creed gameplay experience. The Ezio Trilogy's combining of the system's focus on expression, its respect for the player's autonomy, and the world and/or level design to effectively highlight and employ both of these aspects of its design philosophy created a real skill gap and genuinely rewarded improvement with the game's mechanics. Not only was it possible to get good at parkour in Assassin's Creed, but doing so made the game more fun on a base level and deepened the level of role-playing and immersion into the game's world that the player could achieve. Being able to move with speed, efficiency, and fluidity, and having that level of mastery be a result of one's own proficiency with the system, rather than being success born of mere reliance on streamlined controls ordered towards the prevention of failure, builds a level of synchronization with the protagonist that cannot be achieved in any other way. In other words, the point of playing an Assassin's Creed game is to feel like a master assassin, and being good at the game makes that feeling stronger. This is why the Ezio Trilogy still stands as the series' pinnacle in terms of parkour, and represents the final instance of Assassin's Creed truly embodying the words of its titular doctrine in its gameplay. Following movement systems have managed to produce engaging and enjoyable experiences, but the original remains the only one to have truly understood the purpose of movement in the franchise, and to have really done it right.
At this point in our story, we're reminded that Assassin's Creed is indeed a video game series, and alongside that fact, we must accept certain business practices that can infringe on the purity of a narrative, namely with downloadable content. However, whilst it stands hard to argue that the unskippable paid chapters of Assassin's Creed 2 don't crucify the game's pacing, they do most certainly add an additional layer to what thus far has been a relatively linear journey for Ezio. A journey interrupted by Girolamo Savonarola as the apple is taken away from the clutches of the assassins for a brief time, and returned alongside Ezio to the place of our hero's first call to adventure. Not just Florence, but the precise spot, the exact gallows, where 22 years prior, Ezio had a new life thrust upon him. Standing in the spot where his father and brothers died, Ezio looks at the city he once loved, not with the same brash passion he had as a boy, but with a reluctant disappointment, a recognition that in spite of all of his efforts, the home he so dearly wants to protect will forever return to the cycles of corruption, dogma and chaos that is so intrinsic to the human condition. And it's here where Ezio has the realization he needs before he begins the greatest chapter of his journey.
Silenzio! Silenzio! 22 years ago, I stood where I stand now, and watched my loved ones die, betrayed by those I had called friends. Vengeance clouded my mind. It would have consumed me, were it not for the wisdom of a few strangers, who taught me to look past my instincts. They never preached answers, but guided me to learn from myself. We don't need anyone to tell us what to do. Not Savonarola, not the Medici. We are free to follow our own path. There are those who will take that freedom from us, and too many of you gladly give it. But it is our ability to choose whatever you think is true that makes us human. There is no book or teacher to give you the answers, to show you the path. Choose your own way. Do not follow me or anyone else.
There is no linear evolution. There is only a circumambulation of the self. Uniform development exists at most at the beginning. Later, everything points towards the center. Italy is a nation historically held together by its center, the beating heart of Europe that is Rome. A nation within a nation, a world within a world. Rome is spoken of in Assassin's Creed 2 almost as a mystical, unreal realm, detached from the intercity squabbling of the rest of its Italian sphere. This enormous centerpiece acts as the core of the country Ezio so proudly defends, but along the same token, it stands as a towering beacon of domination, of control, and, as Ezio's greatest enemy to this point takes its papacy, of tyranny. By the turn of the century, 1499, Ezio is left having travelled to the four metaphysical corners of his world, physically represented in the game world by the cities of Florence, his home, San Gimignano, a place of safety, Forli, a place of corruption, and Venice, a place of both fear and of hope. Rome, however, stands as the place of the unknown, the middle of the hedge maze, the belly of the whale, the innermost cave in which lies the vault spoken of since Ezio was merely 19, a vault he never truly took seriously until now, the deep underbelly of the core of Ezio's world, where lies mystery and the final obstacle to Ezio finding an understanding of his purpose. After the years of journeying across Italy, meeting countless allies, moving through the world in accordance with his journey, Ezio was left on his 27th birthday without any understanding of a greater purpose, but a sudden, burning desire to discover what lies in his innermost self. And the only place to find that out, that potentially dark truth, is to make a pilgrimage, physically to Rome, and symbolically to the point in which he must accept voluntary suffering for a higher purpose. In other words, he must take on his role as the prophet, regardless of how much it further reveals his own lack of knowledge and understanding as to the workings of the world. But first, he must face Rodrigo Borgia, a man who began as the driving force for Ezio's journey, but now a man that stands almost as an afterthought to the assassin. After standing in the same position his father had to stand in 2 decades prior, Ezio was able to recognize that the patterns of human nature continue on, regardless of who leads it or who causes it, regardless of which figurehead stands atop the hierarchy, encouraging the behaviors that cause suffering. Ezio sees that in killing Rodrigo, he would do nothing but leave temporary space for a new power to replace him, an even more dastardly and evil force. And so, in a parallel to the opening shots of the boy on the bridge all those years ago, Ezio unsheaths his weapon and stands in hand-to-hand combat against the father who killed his father, against the man that made him who he is now. Leaving Rodrigo alive and leaving him to the side, Ezio connects the 2 pieces of Eden, the papal staff and the apple, both symbols of tyrannical power within the deepest confines of the most powerful institute that the world has ever known. And he uncovers a vault wherein lies a message more powerful than any book written by man ever could be. He uncovers a message, left from a god, left from an ancient race of beings warning of what lies ahead, a catastrophe stopped only through the eyes and memories of Ezio. In this moment, he acts as the prophet. He passes on this warning to his descendant, and he's left with no further understanding, but a rejuvenated burning passion to seek it. No longer do the extra-personal conflicts that have driven Ezio throughout the entire game consume his mind or soul. All vengeance and concern for societal power struggles erased from his mind. No, now he's left to seek 2 things: personal satisfaction and actualization of his soul. Assassin's Creed 2, for the most part, seems to be a complete story, a complete journey of a Florentine noble accepting his place as a prophet and of an assassin, and whilst cliffhangers are left in terms of the secondary narrative stream of the game, that being the modern day, Ezio's story could have very easily been left where it was. However, were that to happen, I would not be making this video, because AC2 leaves the most vital chapters of Ezio's life untold, his greatest and most important songs unsung, and leaves him without the vital understanding of his innermost self that is set up for him in his first appearance. So when placing the disc for Assassin's Creed Brotherhood in a console and being immediately returned to the vault, the audience is left not understanding exactly where Ezio's journey will take him next. A point exacerbated by the peaceful return to Monteriggioni with his uncle, in which Ezio sustains a new lease on life, a disregard for war and combat, now set on a life of philanthropy, of building up his community and his own personal relationships, newfound motivation signified by his helping of his townsfolk and his reacquaintance with Caterina Sforza. Because before Ezio can pursue his desire for self-understanding, he must first break through barriers ignored by the man over his 2 decades of vengeance. Before he can dive into his inner conflicts, he must first come to connect with the personal conflicts he's ignored, which act as the gap between himself and his conscious desire, that of family, friends, and lovers. It goes without saying that to this point, family has been Ezio's greatest driving motivator, and in his return to Monteriggioni, he is left with family ties that have been weakened, that with his mother and sister, but also those that have been strengthened, that with Mario. It's made clear early on that one of Ezio's main focuses in his return from his mission is to repair bonds with Claudia, to be the brother and the head of his family that he needs to be, that he planned to be before he left all those years ago. However, these plans of brotherhood must wait, as it's made clear to Ezio that in spite of his inner peace with Rodrigo, that his decision to spare the Pope will have dire consequences on the assassins, consequences that are brought about only the next again day, as everything Ezio, Claudia and Mario build up is torn down by a new force, a force which not only destroys the Auditore Villa, the physical remains of Ezio's blood family, but also his last remaining male tie to it. Ezio's uncle Mario, his guardian and protector for 20 years, is shot in the street like a dog, and in an instant the dynamic of Ezio's new life is shattered, replaced with what could easily be the same pit of vengeance Ezio just escaped from. Ezio, however, signifies his great growth, his disillusionment for the fulfillment of vengeance, and instead immediately seeks a return to his innermost cave, a return to Rome. In this moment, Ezio could easily lose hope, lose faith, become jaded and nihilistic, seeing these constant attacks as unstoppable cycles of tragedy. But instead, having already gone through such tragedies before, Ezio makes the decision to stand up, to move forward, and to seek out a side of humanity that redeems the horrors he witnesses. Claudia, meanwhile, left for 20 years to essentially run the goings-on of Monteriggioni entirely by herself, has long accepted the dissolvement of what her life was to be before the death of her father, and so stands as a capable, confident, and resourceful woman. A stark contrast to the teenage girl Ezio had to smuggle out of Florence 20 years prior, and so understandably, when Ezio makes efforts to put his mother and sister on a track of safety, his wishes are ignored. Following him to Rome, Claudia takes the skills and abilities built up over 2 decades of running an entire town to take control of the largest brothel in Rome, an undertaking Ezio fights against, an undertaking he doesn't understand thanks to missing the growth of his sister from the teenage girl he must protect to the woman that within her contains the same passion for leadership that was passed to both of them from Giovanni. The intrinsic need to protect his family, built in him from birth and further solidified after the executions of his family, was the inciting motivator for Ezio's entire journey, but through Claudia, he's forced to let it go, to recognize within his sister the same aspects that are within him, and to recognize that she is not simply the sister he needs to hide away and protect, but the sister he can stand side by side with, that carries the auditory name in the same way that he does, and by extension is the same assassin that he is. That reminds me, thanks to the more personal aspect of Assassin's Creed Brotherhood, by extension there's a lot more focus on the Brotherhood itself, focus which builds up a fantastic new mechanic and doubles as an additional growth for Ezio's character. As Ezio abandons his destroyed home of Monteriggioni, as he leaves to return to Rome, he's reminded by his mother, by Maria, to remember for whom the assassins fight. Not for their own revenge, not for their own redemption, not for hatred or for power, but in order to safeguard humanity's free will. This reminder, although brief, comes from perhaps Ezio's most trusted and beloved source, the first person we truly ever see in this trilogy, his mother. And so it stays at the forefront of his mind as he's taken to Rome, after he heals from his wounds and gets a lay of the land. In spite of a request to meet Machiavelli, Ezio overhears of a hanging, a merchant fighting back against the execution of his wife, and disregarding his immediate plans, Ezio carries out his duty to the people of Rome, people that unlike Florence he has no connection to, but people he must protect all the same. In this moment we see those people, downtrodden, starving and begging in the streets, out of work, the roads of Rome dripping in chaos, suffering and misery, all dripping down from the powers that be, preventable misery, brought about by the tyranny of the Borgia. Ezio sees in the people a spark of willingness to liberate themselves, the man who he saves from the Borgia guard's wrath ultimately desperate to fight back, but without the tools to do so. Running in stark contrast from the booming renaissance of the prior game, we now see an Italy entirely oppressed, ruled with a truly iron fist, with only one man willing to take on the risk of standing with the people against their oppressors. Even Machiavelli, Ezio's closest advisor, and at this point the de facto head of the Assassin Order, looks cynically on Ezio's optimistic view of the people. He sees relying on the masses akin to building on the sand, and although agreeing that the people act as the source of the Borgia's power, largely unwilling to entertain Ezio's idea to remove that source and to use it as a tool to liberate the city and the nation. Leaving Ezio alone in this endeavour, it takes a great rebuilding of Rome, via the incredibly improved economy system of the game, alongside the recruitment of downtrodden citizens willing to fight and train in the ways of the Assassin Order, for Ezio to convince his most trusted advisor of the truth of the Assassin Order. An unbreakable belief in humanity lays directly at the heart of the creed they claim to follow, and to neglect that would not only make them hypocrites, but would lead to inevitable failure in their goals. Ezio recognises the importance of citizenship in his time rebuilding Monteriggioni. He witnessed firsthand the genuine love the city of Florence had for Lorenzo de' Medici, and he too saw the horrors of repression left unopposed in Savonarola. As I've said before, he recognised that killing 1 or 2 men, erasing one family, is nothing without strong and caring people to take their place. That tyranny can't truly be ended by a single death, but by a reformation of society's collective unconscious. And so Ezio makes it his chief priority, not to kill the Borgia family as his advisors would prioritise, but to liberate Rome of their lasting influence, regardless of whether he need take on the endeavour alone. And although not immediate, he would eventually get some friends on board. The archetypal hero, as we've already established, is a person who, in the opinion of others, has extraordinary achievements, abilities, or personal qualities, and is regarded as a role model or an ideal. And whilst in his opening moments was presented as much, Ezio progressively transitioned to the menteeship of others, being guided by those wiser in the tenets of the Brotherhood and in the ways of life. Reaching his middle age, however, Ezio witnesses the mentors, the allies that came together to guide him, ripped apart by personal conflicts, by contradictory ideals. Without a support network, without their respective alliances, he recognizes no hope in the Order of Assassins achieving their goals, not simply in undermining Borgia influence, but in generally protecting mankind and living in accordance with their creed. Infighting, quarrels, interpersonal conflicts, all issues not unfamiliar to a leader, but to Ezio an entirely new predicament at his feet, a predicament that instinctually he takes on without a second thought. The ability to lead, to bring people together, is a trait we've seen Ezio maintain from the first moments we saw him, a natural talent for influence and friendship. He understands something Machiavelli doesn't, the virtue of true, genuine kindness and philanthropy, without any expectation for a return. Niccolo sees people as inherently greedy, selfish and fickle, which leads him to shut out and neglect those who reflect said traits. Ezio, though, recognizes the truth in Machiavelli's belief and utilizes it in a productive way instead of turning to cynicism. He aids La Volpe, Bartolomeo and Claudia. He provides a genuine benefit to all three, and they become more willing to aid him in return. Meanwhile, Ezio provides to the people of Rome a united purpose, a purpose lacking from their day-to-day lives, and in return, they take on his leadership and mentorship. Ezio understands the principle that Dale Carnegie laid out in his landmark book, How to Win Friends and Influence People. He honestly sees things from others' points of view. He's sympathetic to their desires and ideas, and he appeals to motives nobler than that of interpersonal squabbles. He's able to unite broken friendships under a unified goal, that of the liberation of Rome, and as he brings allies together, as he creates and maintains strong bonds, those around him in turn award him with authority and with status, a law of equal exchange. For as Ezio rebuilds the Order of Assassins and rebuilds the city of Rome, he's made mentor of the Brotherhood in return. He takes on the highest honor the creed can offer, and in turn, he symbolically becomes the greatest version of himself, in order to take on his greatest task, his supreme ordeal, Cesare Borgia.
I intend to write a book about you one day.
If you do, make it short.
Ezio Auditore, the son of Giovanni Auditore, a charismatic leader, a strong soldier, set on the preservation of humanity's free will. Cesare Borgia, the son of Rodrigo Borgia, a charismatic leader, a strong soldier, set on complete conquest of Italy. Ezio and Cesare are in essence reflections of one another, fundamentally the same in near all aspects bar one, their vision for the world. Cesare, the leader of the papal army, holds the strongest power on earth in his hands, bestowed upon him by his father, and by extension he holds no concept more important than that of power. In other words, the sole occupant of Cesare's mind is the gaining of more power. He cares not for the grand role his father's placed upon his shoulders. No, he has a grander vision for himself, not as a man with a part to play, but as a god, born in the center of Christianity, set on leading humanity into a new world, a world that sees him at its precipice. Whilst Rodrigo killed Ezio's family for the sake of political influence, Cesare destroys all Auditore lineage. He murders Mario and tears down Montergione out of no other reason than his urge for destruction, a carnal desire to conquer. Rodrigo was a calculated opponent for Ezio, but this made him predictable, it made him understandable, at times it makes him sympathetic. Cesare, on the other hand, has a crazed bloodlust and an affinity for chaos that makes him entirely unpredictable, requiring Ezio to be ready for attack at all times. He's arrogant, he's brash, traits that applied to Ezio not too long prior, traits that could have been fueled into an unrecognizable version of himself. Cesare acts as Ezio's greatest challenge, his most epic foe, his supreme ordeal, not only because of his grand papal military force, not due to his combat skill or his tactical wisdom, not even due to the chaotic insanity that Cesare casts onto the world. No. Cesare acts not only as a reflection of Ezio, but as a picture-perfect image of what Ezio could have become had he not had the right guidance, had he let his vengeance consume him. The vicious, tyrannous, merciless madman Ezio sees ruling over Rome acts as such a personal opponent to Ezio because of what he represents. Both men are capable of taking over Rome in a sense. Both men capable of killing and of fighting without remorse. Only the two's motives, having both been nurtured over 3 decades, differ. And it's thanks to the Brotherhood guiding him, thanks to the Creed, that Ezio can stand above Cesare, stand side by side with his brothers and sisters that he's culminated, and fight back against the most ferocious embodiment of the Templars' tyranny to date. Instead of a grand final battle, a momentous sword fight in which only one man can be the victor, the confrontational climax of this family feud is presented as a race against time, a race to uncover the Piece of Eden, the ancient artifact that first diminished Ezio's desire for revenge, the artifact that Cesare stole from him, the metaphorical sword that Ezio must seize in order to truly stand as the victor to this conflict. As he seizes the apple, his grand reward for the trials and tribulations he's taken on throughout the prior 3 decades, Ezio finally decides, for the first time, to utilize its power. Only when Ezio successfully came to stand as the mentor of the Brotherhood could he chance wielding the unwieldy power of the Isu's mind-altering machines. But now blessed by Machiavelli, by Bartolomeo, Claudia, Maria, La Volpe, and all those who stand in the Brotherhood beside him, Ezio takes on the responsibility of carrying the device, a responsibility held by his uncle at the beginning of the game, a responsibility which now converts him into a near unbeatable opponent that Cesare can only try to hold off for so long. In the end, however, it's not Ezio's wrath that destroys Cesare, but the very thing that Cesare used to come to power in the first place: political influence. All those years ago, the Auditore family was executed by means of the corrupt political underground of Italy, and now, with the official insider Fabio Orsini on their side, the assassins have gained the trust of Rome and the influential sway to have Cesare's tyrannous reign come to an end in diplomatic fashion. It was never Ezio's ability to wield a blade that made him who he was, that allowed him to win his battles. It was his ability with people, a love of people, a genuine love consistently returned. Whether it be Leonardo, Antonio, Mario, Bartolomeo, Ezio consistently proved to be a far better leader than he was a fighter, a far better diplomat than he was a swordsman, and although he twice missed the opportunity to get revenge and kill his familial rivals, his dedication to his principles gained him an unbreakable respect by his peers and enemies alike. To win his greatest battle, Ezio need not get revenge on his family again, but instead build a new family, a greater family, a Roman, an Italian family of real people who were willing to stand by his side and who also held his principles. And in the end, this family, Ezio's family, proved to be an unstoppable force.
Insieme per la vittoria! Vittoria agli assassini!
You may notice that of the 3 personal conflicts I mentioned earlier, that of friends, family, and lovers, thus far there's been one that I've missed out. It was without a doubt necessary in his journey for Ezio to overcome these personal obstacles, in order to develop into the mentor and into the version of himself that could defeat his greatest foe. He had to learn to put trust in his family and let go of his trauma. He had to develop and display leadership skills that would allow for the rebuilding of the Brotherhood. However, in the third major personal aspect of life, Ezio's actualization into the mentor came through notably separate means. For instead of embracing love and romance, it took Ezio letting go of all hopes of the traditionally romantic life that would have been laid out for him in Florence. For all his optimism, he would instead need to become cynical about the base idea of romantic love, in order to cope with his position in the world, detached from the personal conquests intrinsic to the human experience, understanding that it may be a necessary sacrifice made for the greater good. This recognition of the sacrifice of romantic love is embodied first by Caterina Sforza, a romantic interest of his past that returns to Ezio in his first time of peace in 2 decades. Finally, it seems, Ezio has found the tranquility to enjoy the riches of romance and of love, but that tranquil sea is of course immediately turned to a stormy ocean with the ever-present Borgia influence that haunts the entire game, and that has time and time again stolen from Ezio that which he can only dream for: a normal life. He recognizes after later rescuing Caterina from the Castel Sant'Angelo, literally saving a princess from the tower of a castle, that he acts not as the mighty lover saving his soulmate, but instead a now very influential ally, one that can help grant political influence. Ezio comes to realize that in his current form as the mentor, the leader of the people of Rome, that for any normal woman to love him would be flattery, and for any esteemed woman to do so, simply a neutral move in the everlasting game of politics so intrinsic to Italy as we've seen it. This recognition of a near unlovability, a realization of the fallacious nature all potential relationships would hold, opens in Ezio memories repressed, memories of his first and perhaps only true love, the kind of teenage unconditional love that rides the line of complete excess. The kind of developmental love that can only be experienced once. His complicated romance with Cristina Vespucci. An added layer of personal desire snatched by the Borgia and by Ezio's new life. A relationship truly impossible to maintain. A situation which forced Ezio to choose between his love and his duty. A place of comfort and easy passion, replaced with a journey filled with struggle, with responsibility, which Ezio must give in exchange of finding purpose.
Cristina! Cristina! Piacere, Cristina. I'm Ezio.
Well, Ezio, Looks like you got yourself a second chance.
I want you to come with me.
I want to. But I can't. My family.
So we'll always be together, Christina.
Ezio, it's been 2 years.
And I've thought of nothing but you.
Oh, but Ezio,
What is it?
I'm engaged to be married.
Do you love her? What? Do you love her? Christina! The woman you're about to marry. He's fine. He'll make a good husband. I made sure of it.
What?
Christina, it's all right.
All right? I haven't seen you in 8 years.
See, I was afraid you wouldn't come if I'd just asked.
You're right. I wouldn't have. You had your second chance. Please, Ezio, don't ever find me again.
Where is Christina? Manfredo! Where is she?
She ran. They went after her.
Christina, hold on. I'll get you to a doctor. You're going to be all right.
No, Ezio. I don't think I am.
No! Don't go. Stay with me, Christina.
Ezio, don't you know? I've always been with you. I wish we could have had a second chance.
Requiescat in pace, my love.
Seeing these repressed memories not only adds to the decision of Ezio as a 20-year-old man to undertake the journey he's now on, but it gives insight to the further cynicism he feels towards the idea of romance. An idea which was sparked once again by Caterina, but was swiftly erased. By the end of Brotherhood, Ezio has mastered his friendships and alliances. He has found and built an entirely new family, and he has definitively given up on lovers, leaving him, after overcoming the supreme ordeal of Cesare Borgia, with a long way to go. Ezio has by no means come into alignment with his inner self. He has chapters yet to be written. Easy is the descent to the lower world, but to retrace your steps and to escape to the upper air, this is the task. This is the toil. Standing as a man of 50, with the visions of the great horrors of humanity imprinted upon him, our hero Ezio no longer stands as the optimistic and good-spirited boy we saw in Assassin's Creed 2, nor is he the passionate leader that rebuilt the city of Rome from ruin. No, the Ezio we see now is a living legend, a silver ghost that walks the world only out of his own sheer curiosity, his self-assessed goal, to uncover the depths of his ancestry and of his creed. As his brotherhood takes a hold on Europe, as his greatest enemies lay dead and buried, his journey has taken him to the point that seemingly has no future. He has no war, he has no fight, and without it he's left truly alone, in spite of the family he's rebuilt. Because Ezio is no longer a mere man, but a walking myth. Everyone knows of him, many fear him, many adore him, but no one, bar perhaps his sister and his best friend, actually know the man that is Ezio Auditore. He has ventured to the darkest corners of his world and fought the most intimidating of enemies, and now he's left chasing ghosts, chasing memories, chasing the wisdom of his long dead comrades. He fails to find a place among the living, and so he wishes to stand with the dead. That is, of course, until he is, in essence, forced to travel to the crossroads of the world, to a fallen Constantinople, in search of the keys that will unlock the wisdom he seeks. But this mystical city brings Ezio wisdom far greater than any of that beneath Masyaf Castle. To quote Christopher Vogler, author of The Writer's Journey, this stage psychologically represents the resolve of the hero to return to the ordinary world, and implement the lessons learned in the special world. The ordinary world in Revelations is that of Istanbul, a city representative of the bond in the Brotherhood between Europe and Asia, and in turn the bond between Ezio and Altair as assassins. A city that for the first time Ezio need not rebuild from tyranny or protect from Templar power, a city that he may simply exist in. That is, until his own selfish intentions put at risk the entire stability of the city and its people. For the first time in a long time, Ezio makes decisions that, although completely in line with his motivations, disrupt the status quo. He becomes the destroyer of the ordinary world by involving himself in political conflicts that he need not get involved in, by mistakenly killing the leader of one of the Assassin's ally factions, and worst of all, by meeting Sofia Sartor. If Ezio were, to this point, the infallible hero that some seem to think he's presented as, then he would not allow himself to get emotionally invested in the people around him. He would complete his mission with pinpoint precision and with unstoppable force. But Sofia, for the first time in almost 30 years, stops him completely in his tracks, and reminds Ezio that although he stands as the legendary mentor and fighter that his reputation so often claims, he is still a man, flesh and bone like everyone else. He may be the most interesting man in her life, but he is still just a man, and sometimes that's all someone needs to be. Sofia is able to open the part of Ezio that was closed off since Christina's death. She unsheaths the loving, carefree boy that still stands within this weathered veteran warrior, and she allows Ezio to see that the path he believes to be the correct one may not always be it. Perhaps the archetypal road back for Ezio isn't a road back to the Assassin Order. It isn't a road back to wisdom or glory, to his brotherhood, and certainly not to the corpses of his ancestors. But instead, his road back is a road of love. Love represented in the form of an Italian woman, with a lust for knowledge, a curiosity about the world that Ezio in turn can feed and explore. Ezio at this point is a living legend, travelling the world like a silver ghost, spreading wisdom and seeking greater knowledge. But perhaps he had already fulfilled his purpose. Perhaps he had done his part. Perhaps it was time, after this final mission, to not travel the world with intentions of spreading his creed, but instead travel the world as to take it in, to explore, to be a man, in love and with a family, a true blood family, once again. That is a dream Ezio may have only thought possible for others, but through Sofia, he can finally let go of the brotherhood he rebuilt, the creed he's lived his life by for 3 decades, and the label he's allowed to stick to him for too long. So many hero's journey stories that we see end not with the entire cycle of the archetype complete, but at the midpoint, right after the conquering of the supreme ordeal, in the peak and prime of our hero's life. However, as we all know, life persists. There are no credits to roll. There is no great climactic third act that puts it to an end. In turn, we as people persist, ever-changing, ever-evolving, never truly capable of embodying our greatest self. That is until our self-evolution ends alongside our life. If a hero were to reach a physical prime, a leadership role that granted him the ability to face his greatest foe, it may perhaps seem as if that is the final stage of self-actualization for the hero. But if the hero were to maintain that exact same mental, physical, and spiritual frame for the rest of their days, it would not be honorable. It would mean that they simply stagnated. No, it's not for the hero or any man, woman, or person to stagnate, to accept their current form and simply exist within it. We must all constantly evolve, constantly build on what came before, and like a phoenix, continually be rebirthed as a newer, wiser, and greater version of ourself. Ezio, finally relinquishing the creed, enters the catacombs of the original place of the rebirth of the Brotherhood, within the deepest corners of Masyaf, a symbolic womb of sorts, where lies the remnants of Altair, a connecting line of Ezio's ancestral lineage, and the visual reflection of where the version of Ezio we know is, the version of Ezio we know to be an assassin. Without Sofia by his side, perhaps Ezio would have sat alongside Altair, taking his rest in the heart of the Brotherhood. But in seeing Altair's final message, Ezio recognizes that there's no virtue in standing by a creed simply out of some illusory dedication. Purpose is not found in dogma or in an arrogant denial to relinquish the ideal of what we once were. Purpose is found when one has the ability to let go of their prior self, to accept the passage of time, and with it the spiritual rebirth of oneself. When someone has the humility to admit that they have done enough for one life, and can finally move on to their next. And Ezio, the once arrogant young Florentine noble, takes this final piece of wisdom that his brotherhood bestows upon him. He unsheaths the blade that's been attached to him for 30 years. He lays down his weary weapons, and passes on one final message.
I have lived my life as best I could, not knowing its purpose, but drawn forward like a moth to a distant moon. And here at last, I discover a strange truth. That I am only a conduit for a message that eludes my understanding. Who are we, who have been so blessed to share our stories like this, to speak across centuries? Maybe you will answer all the questions I have asked. Maybe you will be the one to make all this suffering worth something in the end. Now, listen.
In his seeking for understanding, in his seeking of a higher purpose, he realizes that it's of greater meaning to relinquish any desire for a higher purpose, and instead to accept his place as the prophet, as a conduit for a message that truly does elude his understanding. He has experienced immeasurable suffering. He has done everything he can to fulfill the fate bestowed upon him, and finally, as he, his ancestor, and his descendants stand together in the same room, he is rebirthed, passing on his mantle to future generations, and stepping down from his role as the hero. As Joseph Campbell so eloquently puts it, this hero has finally completed his journey, and he has become the man of self-achieved submission.